Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, November 11th, 2025. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. bombs Somalia for the 90th time this year. To me, this seems like a newsworthy story, but apparently no other media outlet in the United States agrees with me. So U.S. Africa Command said in a press release on Monday that its forces launched an airstrike in Somalia on November 8th, marking at least the 90th time that the U.S. has bombed the country this year. AFRICOM said the strike targeted the ISIS affiliate in Somalia's northeastern Puntland region and that it was launched about 40 miles southeast of the Gulf of Aden port city of Bosaso, a remote area of the Kal Misgad Mountains where these battles have been taking place. The command offered no other details about the strike as it has stopped sharing casualty estimates and assessments on civilian harm earlier this year. The command said, quote, specific details about units and assets will not be released to ensure continued operations security, end quote. So the U.S. backs local security forces in Puntland as the U.S.-backed federal government, which is based in Mogadishu, does not control the territory. Back in 2024, the Puntland government actually withdrew from the federal system in response to amendments to the Constitution made by the federal government that it did not agree with. So this government, this Puntland government, has been in the news lately. They've come under criticism over these reports that the UAE has been shipping weapons to the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF, in Sudan through an airbase in Bosaso. And the RSF has been accused of committing genocide in Sudan. And its fighters have committed horrific atrocities when they took over Al-Fashir in western Sudan. And that city was under siege for over 500 days, or just horrific situation. And there's pretty, what I think, credible reporting that the UAE is shipping weapons through Bosaso, through Puntland. And, you know, this is being facilitated by this Puntland government. And this is another ally, another government that nobody in the U.S. has probably ever heard of, that is being backed by the U.S., that's receiving military support and air power from the U.S. That's also facilitating these weapon shipments to the RSF. And the U.S. has been providing Puntland with significant air support in its war against Somalia's ISIS affiliate. At the end of October, as we covered on this show, AFRICOM conducted airstrikes in this same region for 3 consecutive days. And Somalia's ISIS affiliate is an offshoot of Al-Shabaab, which is a group the U.S. has been fighting since it first emerged in 2007. And Al-Shabaab is the radical offshoot of the Islamic Courts Union, which was a coalition of Muslim groups that briefly held power in Mogadishu in 2006 until the U.S. backed an Ethiopian invasion that took them out. And then Al-Shabaab started conducting attacks against Ethiopian troops, occupying Mogadishu, and basically since then the U.S. has been in a war against them, a war that barely gets any attention, over the years, just in general, has barely gotten any attention from U.S. media. And comparably, to the other wars that the U.S. was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's a lower scale. But this year, I mean, what we're seeing is an unprecedented level of U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. I know I cover this a lot, but just for the context here, so 90 airstrikes so far this year, and that's just based on what AFRICOM has told me, basically. The last time they confirmed the number to me was 89, so this airstrike brings it to 90. And Trump completely shattered the record for annual U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, which he set back in 2019 at 63. And then for the context here, Biden launched 51 airstrikes in Somalia throughout his 4 years in office, and Obama launched 48. George W. Bush, according to the official tallies, launched some, 20, I want to say 26. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but somewhere around that. I think he probably did more than that, because there was reports that were never really officially confirmed that the U.S. was providing air support to the Ethiopians when they invaded Somalia, so we don't really know those numbers. But what Trump has done here, again, is just unprecedented in the scale, and no debate about it, not even a conversation about it in the U.S. political scene at all, or any coverage of it, or anything. So it goes on, and hopefully we get more people talking about it. But the next one here, the U.S. bombs 2 more boats in Latin America. So U.S. airstrikes in Africa and U.S. airstrikes in our hemisphere. So U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth announced on Monday that the U.S. military bombed 2 more boats that he claimed, without providing evidence, were carrying drugs in the eastern Pacific Ocean. The strikes bring the total number of boats that the U.S. has bombed since early September to 20, including 10 that were targeted in the Caribbean and 10 that were hit in the eastern Pacific. Hegseth said that the latest bombing killed a total of 6 narco-terrorists, which is this term that they're using to justify these extrajudicial executions at sea for a crime that does not get the death penalty in the United States. So this is murder on the high seas. And this brings the total number of people killed to 75. So they're putting up, they're really keeping up this bombing campaign. And so some of the background here, we've been covering a lot lately just about the growing scrutiny of this bombing campaign from members of Congress, although the Senate completely failed to reassert any sort of war powers authority over President Trump by voting against. There's 2 war powers resolutions, one to stop these strikes and one to prevent Trump from attacking Venezuela without congressional authorization, and they both failed. So that's very unfortunate, but we've just seen more and more criticism of this bombing campaign in the region, and still signs that they're pushing toward that escalation with Venezuela. So the next story here, U.S. troops train in Panama for the first time in decades in the jungles of Panama. So the U.S. War Department has begun sending conventional ground forces to Panama for training in jungle warfare for the first time in more than 2 decades. And this was reported by ABC News on Monday. So news of the training in Panama comes amid a major U.S. military buildup in the region and this push toward a potential war with Venezuela, a country that has a lot of jungles, and they're doing jungle warfare training here. A U.S. military official told ABC that the training in Panama is not intended to prepare troops for a potential mission in Venezuela, but President Trump has reportedly been reviewing options for attacking the country. So the U.S. has not sent enough forces to the region for like a full-scale invasion, and I really don't think that that's on the table here. But U.S. military planners do believe that they have enough forces if they wanted to seize some airfields and ports in Venezuela. I think they probably have in mind some of the islands off of Venezuela. I know at least one has a military base. And then there's also, I think, airfields that they have their eye on near the border with Colombia. And according to the New York Times, one of the options presented to President Trump would involve sending troops to capture airfields or oil fields inside Venezuela. So they are discussing the idea of actual, boots on the ground here. And the ABC report said that U.S. soldiers and Marines are participating in a 3-week training course, once called Green Hell due to the similarities to combat in Vietnam, at this base in Panama. That's formerly known as Fort Sherman. So the jungle training course at the base was shuttered in 1999 when the U.S. pulled troops out of the country as part of a deal to cede control of the Panama Canal to Panama, to the government. And earlier this year, if you remember, there was all this talk from Trump, Hegseth, about retaking the Panama Canal. And essentially what it led to was the U.S. signing a deal with Panama to redeploy troops there for training exercises to bases along the canal. And, while we're talking about Panama, you see proponents of regime change in Venezuela, people who want the U.S. to go to war, pointing to the U.S. and invasion of Panama in 1989, when the U.S., which ended with the U.S. arresting Noriega, who was the leader of Panama at the time, a former CIA asset that I guess used up his usefulness to the United States. So a lot of people point to this, say, look, we did it with Noriega, it was no problem. But a major difference between Panama and Venezuela, first, besides just the size of the countries, is the fact that the U.S. had a very long established military presence in Panama at the time of the invasion. Don't have anything like that in Venezuela. So it's just a very different situation here. All right, so the next one here, Syria's former al-Qaeda leader visits the White House. So President Trump on Monday hosted Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa, the former al-Qaeda leader who took power in Damascus with his group of jihadists known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, in December of last year. So the Syrian presidency said that Sharaa and Trump were joined by Syria's Interior Minister Anas Hassan Khattab, who's another former al-Qaeda member, and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there for the meeting. And then photos of the meeting show that Vice President J.D. Vance and U.S. Ambassador to Turkey Tom Barrack, who has acted as an envoy to Syria, also attended. I also think I saw Hegseth in the background there. So all the high level, the top officials, vice president, head of the Pentagon, attended this meeting with Sharaa. And this was the statement. There wasn't much fanfare about it. They didn't do a joint press conference or anything, or speak with reporters together at all. Not many statements really put out, but Trump said, the meeting went well, and then he likes them, and he responded to some of the criticism. And basically the Syrian presidency put out a pretty boilerplate statement that said Sharaa and Trump, quote, addressed the bilateral relations between the Syrian Arab Republic and the United States, as well as ways to strengthen and develop them, in addition to a number of regional and international issues of common interest, end quote. So the meeting marked the first time that a Syrian president visited the White House since the country gained independence from France in 1946. And this is a guy, if you would have told me like 10 years ago that, at the height of the war in Syria, that Jolani was going to win, was going to become the president of Syria and visit the White House, I would have thought you were insane. But that's what happened here. That's what's happened. And despite his al-Qaeda past, as we've been covering, Sharaa has just been embraced by the Trump administration. So one thing that happened after the meeting, the Treasury Department announced that they were waiving the sanctions on Syria that were imposed under the Caesar Act for another 180 days. So the executive branch has the power to suspend the sanctions. And Sharaa was hoping to get them permanently lifted, but Congress has to do that because the Caesar Act is a law. And Congress hasn't really been in session because of the shutdown. But so they've waived the sanctions again for another half year about. And these Caesar Act sanctions, brutal sanctions. For the record, I think the U.S. should lift these sanctions because just the nature of sanctions, they always hurt civilians. I know from people who have family in Syria who lived in the Assad-controlled areas who said the sanctions were like almost worse than the war, just because how bad the economic situation was after they were imposed. So the Treasury Department, again, they put out that statement. What else do we have here? So Sharaa, he was hoping for permanent lifting, and he met with some members of Congress to make that case, including Brian Mast, the Republican from Florida, super pro-Israel, who volunteered with the IDF at one point and actually wore his IDF uniform to work as a member of Congress, if you remember that. But this is what he said in his statement, which was kind of interesting. He said, quote, last evening, the new Syrian president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, and I broke bread. We had a long and serious conversation about how to build a future for the people of Syria, free of war, ISIS, and extremism. He and I are two former soldiers and two former enemies. I asked him directly, why are we no longer enemies? His response was that he wishes to liberate from the past and have a noble pursuit for his people and his country and to be a great ally of the United States of America, end quote. So, Sharaa goes around, he presents himself as a moderate, but at the same time, his government, his military has been committing horrific atrocities against minorities, especially the Alawites, massacring thousands of them since he took power in Damascus. So I got just more background on him, which we've talked about a lot on this show. But this just goes to show how absurd, U.S. foreign policy is. I keep thinking about how the U.S. blocked Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, from attending the UN General Assembly. Blocked Palestinian Authority officials couldn't go there. Yet they welcomed Sharaa into New York City. I mean, just the hypocrisy and kind of absurdity of U.S. foreign policy is really put on display here. And why do they prefer Sharaa to Assad? Because he's not an ally of Iran and Hezbollah. So, that's essentially what this is all about. This is what a situation Israel prefers more. And then another thing about the situation with Israel. So we covered, was it last week, about this report that the U.S. might establish a military base in Damascus. Well, the idea of that base is for the U.S. to monitor some kind of security deal between Syria and Israel. Don't really know if there's been much progress on that, but Trump said something interesting last week, that he lifted sanctions on Syria at the request of Turkey and Israel. So Israel talks tough about Jelani's government, and he has bombed them a whole bunch. Israel has bombed the country a whole bunch since he took over and invaded and took territory. But again, it's just clear that this was what they wanted. They wanted Assad out. They knew he was going to take power, and this is their preferred situation. All right, so the next one here, Trump says that Marjorie Taylor Greene has lost her way. So President Trump on Monday said that Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia has lost her way after she criticized the president for hosting Syrian President Ahmed al-Sharaa at the White House and for focusing on foreign policy over domestic policy. So Trump told reporters, quote, "I don't know what happened to Marjorie. She's a nice woman, but I don't know what happened. She's lost her way, I think. But I have to view the presidency as a worldwide situation, not locally. I mean, we could have a world that's on fire, where wars come to our shores very easily if you have a bad president," end quote. So saying just, that he's got to be involved in the worldwide situation. And in response, Greene said that she hasn't lost her way, that she's 100% America first. But so Trump's comments came after she put out a post on X very critical of Trump hosting Sharaa at the White House. And she, in the post, she put up a photo of Sharaa when he was known as Jelani, as the Al-Qaeda leader, the wanted poster from the U.S. State Department, and the $10 million bounty on his head. And this stuff was just lifted earlier this year. So Greene said in her post, quote, "The new leader of Syria is a former Al-Qaeda terrorist wanted by our government who is meeting with President Trump today at the White House on the U.S. Marines' 250th anniversary. He rose to power in December 2024. Sanctions were lifted off Syria in June, and many Christians and minority groups have been killed before and after the sanctions were lifted. Syria is the oldest home of Christianity outside of Israel. The Apostle Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus. I pray the persecution ends not only in Syria, but all around the world. However, I would really like to see nonstop meetings at the White House on domestic policy, not foreign policy and foreign countries' leaders," end quote. And in recent months, we've seen Greene come out very strongly against U.S. military aid to Israel, became the first Republican member of Congress to call what Israel has done in Gaza a genocide. So she's been getting all sorts of heat, from the lobby and from pro-Israel, all the Israel firsters in U.S. media and everything. And then you have Trump criticizing her and campaigning for Lindsey Graham and backing Randy Fine and people like that. All right, so the next one here, Israeli drone kills 2 Palestinians in Gaza. So an Israeli drone strike on Monday hit a town to the east of Khan Yunis, southern Gaza, killing 2 people, including a child. This was reported by the Palestinian news agency Wafa. The report said that medical sources reported that the 2 were killed when a drone targeted a group of civilians in the town of Bani Suhaila, east of Khan Yunis. Footage from Turkey's Anadolu agency shows Palestinians mourning the 2 victims of the Israeli drone strike at the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis. A day earlier, an Israeli strike killed 1 person in a tent in the same town. And residents in the area told Al Jazeera that they were beyond the so-called yellow line, which is the boundary that separates Israeli-occupied Gaza from the rest of the Strip, which is just not clearly marked on the ground for the Palestinians. And there's been reports saying that Israel's been enforcing this so-called yellow line beyond the actual line. BBC had a report about how, they were setting these yellow blocks in certain parts of Gaza to mark the line, that they were actually setting them well inside the line, like cutting into the rest of Gaza. And they haven't, as far as I understand, they haven't even put them along the whole line, just in a few areas. So it's just nobody on the ground knows where this line begins. And for that, they get killed. And the IDF on Monday acknowledged killing 2 Palestinians that it claimed they were terrorists and that they posed a threat and crossed the yellow line. They don't even allege that these people that they're killing are armed. It's just, they crossed the line, or who knows if they even actually crossed the line. But they get shot and killed anyway. No chance at for any kind of, warning or anything like that. And Gaza's health ministry said in its daily update on Monday that since the ceasefire was supposed to go into effect on October 10th, Israeli forces have killed 242 Palestinians and injured 622. The Israeli military has also continued demolishing homes inside the yellow line, the systematic destruction of the remaining buildings in the Israeli-controlled areas. All right, so the next one here, Kushner meets with Netanyahu in Israel to discuss Gaza. So President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday to discuss future plans for Gaza and the U.S.-backed ceasefire deal. Despite lacking a formal role in the Trump administration, Kushner has been acting as an advisor to U.S. and Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, and he's been very involved in these negotiations and discussions on Gaza, a place that he once said, I believe it was last year, could have very valuable waterfront property. And he was reportedly the man behind Trump's idea for the U.S. to take over Gaza and turn it into a Riviera and get all the Palestinians out. So this is who's been very involved in all these negotiations. So Kushner and Netanyahu were also joined by Ron Dermer, who's Israel's Minister for Strategic Affairs. He's seen as like Netanyahu's closest ally in the government. And also Ari Lightstone, who's an advisor to Witkoff. There was no public comments about the meeting, but it's assumed that they were talking about the U.S. pushing for the UN Security Council to pass this resolution that would essentially give the U.S. governance of Gaza for 2 years under the so-called Board of Peace, and then deploy this international force. But there's been little progress on deploying this international force to Gaza, as countries that are willing to participate are seeking clarity on what their troops are actually going to be doing. And they don't want to be ending up in a situation where they're fighting Hamas on behalf of Israel. And the one country that seems eager to send troops is Turkey, but that's Israel saying no, that they can't be involved. So now listen to this. So according to a report from Israel Hayom, which this is an Adelson-owned Israeli media outlet, the U.S. military-led task force operating in southern Israel has been in contact with leaders of the Israeli-backed militias and gangs operating in the Israeli-occupied side of Gaza. The largest group that Israel is backing is a gang led by a guy named Yasser Abu Shabab, who admitted to looting aid trucks in 2024. Some members of the Abu Shabab gang, which is based in southern Gaza, have ties to ISIS, according to Israeli officials and reports in Israeli media. So a gang of known criminals with links to ISIS is a group that the U.S. is in contact with, according to this report, about the possibility. The idea is that they're considering using these groups to maintain order in Gaza and act as some sort of law enforcement force. And any effort to use these Israeli-backed groups to kind of assert authority in other parts of Gaza where Hamas is, I mean, that's just going to lead to fighting between the Palestinians. So this does not seem like a good idea, but this is something that apparently, according to this report, the U.S. is considering. And we've actually seen similar language with Kushner and some of these groups. So Kushner has also pushed the idea of allowing reconstruction to start in the Israeli-occupied side of Gaza as a way to pressure Hamas. And he called it a new Gaza, and one of the leaders of one of these other militias has used that language and say, we're going to build a new Gaza on this side. So they got all sorts of ideas. Who knows where this is going to lead? But as things stand right now, we're in this new status quo, which is an Israeli occupation of more than half of Gaza. Palestinians are still being killed every day. And there's still restrictions on aid entering Gaza. People are facing serious food shortages and living in buildings that are collapsing, living among unexploded bombs, living in tents that are falling apart with winter coming. So it's still just a horrific situation for the Palestinians in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Israeli soldiers speak out on killings of Gaza civilians. So this article is from The Guardian. So Israeli soldiers have described a free-for-all in Gaza and a breakdown in norms and legal constraints, with civilians killed at the whim of individual officers, according to testimony in a TV documentary. So one commander of an IDF tank unit said that if you want to shoot without restraint, you can. And this is a documentary called Breaking Ranks Inside Israel's War. And it is due to broadcast in the UK on ITV on Monday evening. I'm going to see if I could find it and watch the whole thing. But some of the IDF soldiers who talked to the program requested anonymity, while others actually spoke on the record, again, about killing civilians. All pointed to the evaporation of the official code of conduct concerning civilians. The soldiers who agreed to talk confirmed the IDF's routine use of human shields, contradicting official denials, and gave details of Israeli troops opening fire unprovoked on civilians racing to reach food handouts at the militarized distribution points set up by the U.S. and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF. So again, these are Israeli soldiers. More confirmation. We've seen other soldiers. I don't know. I want to watch the full documentary to see if there's actually IDF soldiers on the record saying that we were shooting at these people trying to get food. We've seen there's been all sorts of confirmation. I mean, even the IDF has admitted to killing some people and firing artillery shells at crowds of people trying to get food. But so I'm going to see if we could get the full documentary to watch to see what is all revealed here. But nothing, it's all horrific, but it's nothing that's a surprise to anyone who's really been paying attention to what Israel's been doing in Gaza. The next one here, Blinken was warned that Israel was committing war crimes in 2023. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So U.S. officials in the Joe Biden administration repeatedly warned that Israel was committing war crimes in Gaza. The White House ignored the reports to avoid cutting military aid to Israel. Again, another thing that is not a surprise. And we've already known this to some extent. 5 former U.S. officials told Reuters that in December 2023, so all the way back in 2023, the State Department's legal team brought reports to Secretary Antony Blinken showing Israel was breaching international law and committing war crimes in Gaza. Later, the U.S. obtained intelligence that Israeli military leaders had concluded there was evidence to support war crimes charges against Israel. So even the Israelis, the U.S. knew that the Israelis knew that they could be charged for war crimes based on what they were doing in Gaza. And based on U.S. foreign assistance laws, the U.S. is legally required to cut off countries that are committing war crimes. And of course, the U.S. is implicated in so many ways beyond just the fact that they're giving them bombs. There's the intelligence support. There's the political support, everything. So just more evidence that the Biden administration very well knew what was happening. I mean, they there was a report from 972 magazine last year, I think it was last year, that said, in some of these strikes, bombings where Israel used their big 2,000-pound bunker busters and took out whole buildings, that they worked closely with the U.S. on those specific strikes. So they know exactly what they were doing, what they were enabling, what they were, helping Israel commit in Gaza. Just more evidence of that. So the next one here, Israel kills 3 in South Lebanon strikes. So this one's from Jason Ditz. So more Israeli airstrikes on Lebanon killed at least 3 people on basically overnight Sunday into Monday. And another thing, so daily airstrikes continue in Lebanon. And another thing is that Israel is apparently pressuring Lebanon to take their army and go house to house in southern Lebanon to search for Hezbollah weapons. And the Lebanese army rejected it on the grounds that it could cause a civilian war. If you have the army going in, kicking in doors, looking for weapons. But this is something that they're trying to really pressure Lebanon to do. And you had Tom Barrack, the U.S. envoy himself, say that, the U.S. recently gave a big package of military aid to the Lebanese armed forces. And Tom Barrack said, we're not arming them to fight Israel. We're arming them to fight their own people. He actually said that. All right, the next one. I left up the story from yesterday about the Israeli settlers beating the Palestinian journalists in the West Bank. I did look. So this woman who's beaten, Raneen Sawafta, Palestinian journalist who works for Reuters, photojournalist. We have used her pictures before in our stories at antiwar.com, and at least 4 or 5 stories about the West Bank. And this is who the Israeli settlers beat very brutally when she was wearing her press vest. All right. So the next one here, Sami Hamdi to be released from ICE detention. So this article is from Middle East Eye. So British journalist and political commentator Sami Hamdi will be released from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention following a hearing on Monday, according to his legal team. Sami and the government reached an agreement during his hearing that he would leave the U.S. voluntarily. He arrived in the U.S. on October 19th on a valid visitor visa for a speaking tour, but his visa was revoked on October 24th without his knowledge and without being informed by immigration authorities, according to Sharaa Billow, executive director for the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. So he was charged with a visa overstay on October 26th by ICE agents. Even though, again, he was not aware that he lost his visa. And this happened because he's critical of Israel. There's not really any other reason why this happened. And because he's Muslim and he was targeted by Laura Loomer. But it's just, it's this crackdown on speech that is critical of a foreign country that we've seen from this Trump administration. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter. Will the Taiwan issue stay quiet during Trump's term? I have a feeling that it will. One from Jonathan Grotenfent. Honor Veterans Day by ending wars. That's right, it's Veterans Day. One from Ron Paul. Congressional Republicans must stand up to the president on Venezuela. One from Jose Nino. 3 years of sanctions prove John McCain wrong about Russia. And our spotlight from Senator Rand Paul, America First. For the D.C. swamp, it's always war first. So we have both Paul's articles from them. So go check all that stuff out. You could always support us by liking, commenting, subscribing, share the show, follow us on social media. That is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.